listener production. Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Over the past few years, groups of children and young people have tried to force their governments to do something about climate change, not through political campaigns, but by taking them to court.
Every case puts the government on notice, makes sure that the government knows that there are people out there, there are law firms and barristers and young people who are watching what they're doing, who are holding them accountable.
So does that mean kids in court will be the ones to save us from climate change? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Thursday, September 19.
Good morning, Sash. We start today in Lebanon again, where fresh explosions targeting walkie-talkies have killed at least 14 people and injured 450 others. The devices, like yesterday's pages, are believed to have been used by members of the militant group Hezbollah. At least one of the explosions occurred near a funeral organised for individuals killed the day before, with eyewitnesses saying multiple Hezbollah members then frantically removed batteries from their walkie-talkies that had not exploded. Local reports also say some solar energy systems exploded across the country's south, including parts of its capital, Beirut.
Israel is yet to comment on or claim responsibility for either of these blasts. Hezbollah came out afterwards blaming Israel, but that has not been confirmed and Israel hasn't responded. But what we have heard from Israel is from its defence minister, which said yesterday it was entering a new phase of war focused on its border with Lebanon. Hezbollah has promised retaliation, yesterday firing rockets at Israeli artillery positions in the first cross-border attack since the blasts. Now, we still don't know how these attacks are occurring, whether it's supply chain warfare or a remote hack. We went through a couple of the theories of how it might have happened with the pages yesterday. It's still not known how it is going on. Something else that happened early this morning was a vote at the UN. So the General Assembly in its vote was demanding Israel end its presence in Palestinian territories within 12 months. So that's on Gaza, the West Bank and parts of East Jerusalem as well. So the resolution won 124 votes to 12. Australia and the UK were among the countries that abstained from that vote. Israel and the US were among the no votes. So this is obviously an advisory opinion. It is not binding. We've seen multiple votes like this happen in the past. However, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli PM, is due to address the General Assembly in New York next week. So it's an interesting move to happen ahead of his visit.
Back home now, Anthony Albanese has confirmed he'll bring back key housing legislation next month as he continues to threaten an early election. This is all over Labor's help to buy and build to rent schemes, which the Greens have blocked in the Senate, instead calling for a national rent freeze, more social housing and scrapping negative gearing and capital gains taxes. The bills need crossbench support. The coalition has already said it won't support it, but the PM is refusing to negotiate with the Greens. This prompted Albanese to threaten an early election yesterday or a double dissolution.
I'll tell you a way to avoid a DD. It's for the coalition and the Greens to vote for legislation that they support.
Yeah, so you might have heard these words, double dissolution, floating around yesterday, and as we've just mentioned, when this news broke. But what does it actually mean? So a double dissolution election happens when there is a deadlock between the House of Representatives and the Senate, and legislation therefore can't get through. Both houses are dissolved by the Governor-General, usually on the advice of the Prime Minister, and Australia heads to a federal election to vote. Now, we know an election is due to be called by mid-next year, but if a double dissolution happens, it could mean we head to the polls in just a few months. So why can't this particular crop of legislation, build to rent and help to buy schemes, why can't they get through? It's because the Greens control the Senate, so the Greens are blocking its path in the Senate. Labor controls the House of Reps, so it's breezing through the lower house and then it's getting stuck when it gets to the Senate. Now, it's worth noting that his threat of a double dissolution is kind of on rocky ground, because what has to happen is a bill has to fail passing the Senate twice, and there needs to be 3 months between each attempt. Now, if he brings the legislation next month, that's only 1 month between attempts. So I don't really know where he's getting this, we're going to call a DD and it's going to happen. But yeah, so the interesting thing out of all of this is that Labor is refusing to negotiate with the Greens, and the Greens are refusing to budge. So what I think happens is that housing becomes which already was going to be big, but it becomes an even bigger issue for this upcoming election.
Yeah, and I think the most interesting part is that Albert was opted to call it a DD instead of just referring to it in full. But hey, each to their own. And in some tragic news now, it is the end of an era. Tupperware has gone bankrupt.
Meats keep meatier, beats keep beatier, chips keep chippier, dips keep dippier. Tupperware freshness, that's our promise. Look at all the ways we keep it.
Come to a Tupperware party and see all the new ways you can lock in freshness.
Oh, that is so unfair that you've put that audio in there, Sasha. Yes, the iconic company that's been around since 1946 has been forced to respond to dwindling sales and mounting financial losses, filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on Tuesday. Look, Tupperware sales saw a brief spike during the pandemic, but since then they've reported a fall in sales for 6 consecutive quarters since the end of 2021. The brand will look to keep operating during the bankruptcy proceedings and will seek a buyer, so maybe those beautiful, colourful containers will be around a little longer.
Yeah, see, I think we all get sad when a company like Tupperware goes bust, but the reason it goes bust is because we're not buying what they're selling. So I think it's the emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know I've been to a Tupperware party when I was a kid. Chris, have you?
Look, embarrassingly, yes.
It's not embarrassing. It's be proud. My parents still have the Tupperware bowls, and my mother-in-law is a keen Tupperware collector, and I've got some of her hand-me-downs, and it's really good stuff. So it's sad, but really at the end of the day, it's our own fault. And the first ever workplace happiness index has found almost half of us are unhappy at work. So first off, a caveat. This study was done by recruiting company Seek. So remember, they want us to be sad at work and looking for other jobs. Nevertheless, they've done this survey of 1,200 Australian employees, finding Gen Z is the least happy with only half satisfied, while baby boomers are the happiest at more than 60%. The survey found senior leadership and salary are the two top factors of unhappiness at work across all age groups. I don't find that surprising at all. And maybe because of those cushy salary packages and perks, government workers are the most pleased with their lot at work. But construction and engineering staff on the other side are the least happy. So Chris, we're sitting here, we've got a microphone. Are you happy at work?
You said you weren't going to do this. Look, I think I am, but I think we are so uniquely placed. Like, we actually work in a really cool industry and a very cool building. So, like, we get to see a lot of fun people walking through, the studios every day, and we get to have some interesting chats. You're looking up at the ceiling.
Yeah. See, when you've been in the industry as long as I have, that's not that exciting anymore. I, for one, am very happy at work. I love my job, love the briefing,
Me
love
too.
listener.
Hi, executive producer. You're listening from Melbourne.
We love you and we love our job. Chris, thank you so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, it's our deep dive looking at kids suing governments over climate change.
Hey, Bension here. As the climate crisis has become clearer and scarier over the years, it's been easy to feel that we as individuals can't really make any difference. But maybe children can? Kids and young people have been trying a new strategy in recent years. If governments won't act on their own, maybe we can force them to do more using the courts. In Australia, this strategy was actually dealt a pretty devastating blow when the federal court ruled our Environment Minister does not have a duty to protect children from climate change. Anjali Sharma was 17 years old when she led that case against the government. 2 years on, she's a law student and activist, and she joins us to explain what's happened to the global movement of kids suing their governments over climate change and her perspective on the way forward in the face of some very mixed results. Anjali, welcome to the briefing. In the past few days, a group of young climate activists whose case against the US government over its climate policies was rejected by a court earlier this year tried to revive the case. Can you tell us the latest on that?
Yeah, so this group of plaintiffs had their case rejected earlier this year on the basis that courts shouldn't really be ruling on environmental and energy policies. For context, they're arguing that they have a constitutional right to a climate that sustains life, a climate that ensures that they have the ability to thrive into the future rather than being disproportionately affected by adverse climate impacts. The case was thrown out before the US Supreme Court for that reason. The court found that this was a political matter rather than one that the courts should be imposing. But the applicants have argued that that's kind of an overreach of the court, and that the court actually does have the ability to hear this case and the need to hear this case to uphold the rule of law.
Is there any indication of whether they might actually get a hearing in the Supreme Court?
That's up to the powers that be, I feel, but it's a very similar line of logic that we've heard from class actions, from climate litigation around the world. In fact, it's a very similar line to what was touted as the reason to throw out the Sharma Minister for the Environment duty of care ruling, that the courts shouldn't be imposing this duty of care. If it does exist, it should be imposed by Parliament. This issue of judicial conservatism is one that has been held by judges, by courts all around the world, and it's what we saw earlier this year with this case. It's not looking likely that it's one that courts would depart from anytime soon, because it is such an embraced idea around the world, but I would hope that they give this group of applicants a chance. And I truly believe that courts have a role in climate decision making, and if we are to have a climate that sustains life into the future, then we need all of our highest institutions involved, not just the Parliament, but also the courts.
Let's turn to one other case around the world that's been key here. Almost exactly a year ago, 6 Portuguese children took all 27 EU member states, plus the United Kingdom, Norway, Switzerland, Russia and Turkey, to the European Court of Human Rights. Tell us about that case and where it's got to.
Yeah, so as you said, that was a group of Portuguese young people who made an argument that these group of states had not taken sufficient action on climate change. They spoke directly to the disproportionate impacts of climate change on the younger generation. So in general, they argued that the effects of climate disasters such as heat waves and wildfires and smoke from these fires affect people's lives, both materially in terms of smoke and the health and well-being effects that come from that, but also intangibly in terms of emotional well-being and mental health. But they made sure to zero in on the fact that this is a disproportionate burden that is felt by young people and will be felt by young people into the future. Unfortunately, that case was thrown out by the European Court of Human Rights on admissibility issues. The court found that there were mechanisms in Portugal's domestic law, as well as other reasons, that these plaintiffs hadn't used, and they said for that reason they didn't have jurisdiction over this claim.
And finally, let's look at the group of children in South Korea who took their government to court. They argued that laws failing to curb carbon emissions were unconstitutional. We've got a verdict on that one just this month.
Yeah, just recently the South Korean Constitutional Court found that the country's current climate measures were insignificant to safeguard the rights of citizens and particularly younger generations. So this is one of those success stories that have seemed super few and far between, but are becoming increasingly more common, where courts around the world are being ambitious, are being really novel in their rulings and finding that constitutional rights and provisions are being violated in the failure to address climate change, and also acknowledging that disproportionate burden as the South Korean court did.
One of the reasons we've brought you on is obviously you and other young people brought this case against the Australian government. Now, for listeners who aren't familiar, that case lost on appeal in the federal court. Can you just tell me how it felt when the court issued that ruling saying that the Environment Minister does not have a duty of care to protect young people from climate change harm when considering fossil fuel projects?
Yeah, so the ruling in Sharma and Minister for the Environment was another instance of one of those legalistic arguments trumping a moral claim. I think that we had a really sound case in that there's clear logic that flows from the fact that government decisions today will intrinsically shape the futures of young people well into the future. And for that reason, there should be a duty of care to ensure that governments, when exercising their powers, do so in the best interests of young people today and young people tomorrow. Unfortunately, the federal court did not side in our favour for a multiplicity of reasons, one being that they didn't feel that it was the court's job, as I said, to intervene, and that this was a matter for the political process. And it was crashing, honestly, because I think that especially as a young person, you believe so wholeheartedly in the goodness of the highest institutions of the country, that politics is designed to protect you, that the courts are designed to hold government accountable. And when these institutions fail you on very, very technical, nitpicky points, it feels quite devastating. We luckily kept that campaign going based on comments that the judge made in their judgment. And the duty of care concept is not dead following that court ruling. But yeah, hoping to see less of that judicial conservatism as more and more cases are filed across the world.
Do you think it was worth your time to do, given that it ended up failing in the end?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you had talked to me and asked me this question the day after that ruling, I was crushed and I would have told you I had no idea why we took on so much, why we bore the brunt of so much hate, and why we put every last brain cell, every last bit of energy that we had into that case. Looking back on it now with the privilege that hindsight is, I can see how much of an impact that case had. The federal court on both counts accepted without question that climate change firstly is anthropogenic and that climate change will have a disproportionate impact on younger people. And this has now been used as a precedent in further climate cases that have gone to the courts. For example, there's the case of Pabai Pabai and others versus the Australian government, and that's two Torres Strait Islander uncles taking the Australian government to court, arguing that the government owes them, Torres Strait Islander people, a duty of care. And they've used the science that was accepted in our case, and they're building on that precedent. So every case shifts the goalposts, I believe. Every case puts the government on notice, makes sure that the government knows that there are people out there, there are law firms and barristers and young people who are watching what they're doing, who are holding them accountable, and that the courtroom isn't at all like protests, like young people taking to the streets where the government is just able to condescend, to look away. In the courts, they have to have a sound argument and it has to be heard before an independent tribunal of some of the greatest legal experts in the country. And that's somewhere where they can't hide, and they will be increasingly dragged into these forums in the future.
You mentioned in that judgment how the judge decided that it was not the role of the courts, but rather the role of the political system to be deciding climate policy. We've heard the same argument from Obama, Donald Trump and Joe Biden's administrations in the US in their response to these climate cases. Is that a fair enough argument? Should this be a political fight rather than one that happens through the courts?
Absolutely not. I think that courts have a long and established history, firstly, of holding governments to account. We've seen that in so many novel court rulings on all matter of issues. Even here in Australia, Mabo comes to mind, and that was such an incredible novel court ruling that, changed the legal foundation of Australia. And courts are no stranger to that, and they shouldn't be in the world of climate either. More and more cases are starting to go the way that the South Korean case did, and I think that shows that courts really do have an intrinsic part in policymaking, and they shouldn't be shying away from that role.
Given that that case failed, it's 2 years on, what has been the way forward for you now, and also what should be the way forward for other young people who are concerned about this issue?
We've built a political campaign now with a bill to enshrine the duty of care into statutory law, currently before the Australian Senate. So that bill is being tabled by Senator David Pocock, and it has come before the Senate Committee for Environment and Communications and will be voted on hopefully sometime in the next year. So that seeks to do exactly what the court said should be done. The court handballed this responsibility to make policy over to Parliament, and so now we're saying that if the court wash their hands of this responsibility, then it's Parliament's job to step up, because we can't have the country's two highest institutions both wash their hands of that responsibility. In that case, who do young people look to for substantive protection of our rights? It can't be that neither of the institutions that we expect to protect us will step up in this way.
And just finally, very briefly, what would be your message to a young person listening to this right now if they want to take action?
I would say that there's this image of a perfect activist. The perfect activist has to be really good at public speaking, has to know every single everything statistic, data, report about climate change has to be making a difference in their own personal lives and also be running political campaigns. And it's never like that. All you need to do to start making a difference in the world of climate change is to firstly be passionate about the issue and then to use the skills that you already have. There are amazing musicians such as Jack River who are using their platforms to speak up for greater climate action. If you're a sports person, there are amazing organizations like Cricket for Climate and Frontrunners who are doing great work in that realm. So don't rule yourself out of making a difference because you don't think you have the public speaking skills or the ability to talk to the media, because that's never a prerequisite in this kind of forum.
Anjali Sharma, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
Law student and climate activist Anjali Sharma there. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks for listening. Before you go, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone you think might be interested. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.